If a symphony orchestra takes you away to a beautiful, a haunting, or a heartbreaking place, the orchestra and its conductor are doing their jobs. Maestro Bramwell Tovey composes music, he plays music, and he leads musicians who have some of his skills. He's an award-winning music man of striking versatility who has a global reputation for his podium prowess. It is my pleasure to welcome Maestro Bramwell Tovey back to Studio 4 to tell us more.
Gosh, what an introduction. I didn't know what to say.
Well, of course, but I always read your lauds, as they say, and you have many.
Well, thank you very much. This is certainly an interesting concept that we have because we're doing 3 symphonies from the last 300 years.
Well, where to start? Let's start with the definition of symphony. What is a symphony? Sounds like a simple question, but perhaps not.
It's not too complicated, but today it's confused because the vernacular says that a symphony is a group of musicians. And actually, of course, the Vancouver Symphony is called the symphony, and that's true. But actually, a symphony orchestra plays what composers call a symphony, and that is a piece of music that's a sequence of movements, a sequence of arguments, if you like. Usually the first movement is the most profound. It contains both happy and sad thoughts, contrasting thoughts, like any great drama. The first movement can be very dramatic. I'm giving you the quick 101 on this.
Sure, that's good.
The second movement is usually slow. The third movement is usually some kind of a dance, usually a minuet in classical music. And the final movement is usually we call a rondo, which is a lively piece where the tune keeps coming back. Rondo is an Italian word meaning round. So a 4-movement work is a symphony. And we're actually sort of looking at a classical symphony by Joseph Haydn, the Clock Symphony, and then Mahler's Symphony No. 10, which is only 1 movement, and John Adams' Dr. Atomic Symphony, which is a brilliant contemporary masterpiece.
And the modern symphony, as they say, Dr. Atomic. So can a symphony have 5 movements, 8 movements, or not?
Yes, it can. And in fact, with Mahler, he quite often had symphonies with multiple movements. And there are various composers who've had anything up to 10 or 12 movements, usually eccentric ones, because, I mean, how many movements do you want to hear when you're sitting there at a concert?
Exactly. So if I'm in the audience at the symphony,
yes,
and a movement has ended,
yes,
do I clap then?
No need to clap. If you clap, no one's going to care, but there's no need to clap. We invite people at the beginning of concerts to refrain from applauding so that they can think about what they've just heard.
Sure.
But sometimes that's hard when you've heard a very exciting movement and it's very dramatic and it finishes and you feel you want to clap. If you need to clap, go ahead, but it's not necessary.
Well, as you know, people who are not musical and haven't played in an orchestra have no idea when the movement is over.
Well, they
or
do
maybe
clap.
you didn't know that, Maestro.
No, I'm sort of aware of it. Sometimes, usually when people start coughing, that's the signal that the movement's over.
Pretty much over.
Yeah.
Okay, Joseph Haydn, what, 1700, 1793, somewhere in there?
Haydn was a contemporary of Mozart, so he worked in the second half of the 18th century, and he died, I think, in 1809. So he was he lived to be quite an age for that particular. He was much older than Mozart when he died.
Sure, considered the father of the symphony, was he not?
Symphony, he wrote exactly. He wrote 104 symphonies. He worked for the Esterházy family, which was a royal court in both Hungary and Austria. He had his own orchestra. Later in life, he came to London and worked a great deal for London impresarios. He traveled all over Europe, became very famous. But his Clock Symphony is interesting because looking at Dr. Atomic Symphony later in the program, which of course is about a scientific invention, the Clock Symphony is about a clock. And in the second movement, in fact, which I think you have lined up ready to listen to, we can hear this clock motif.
So before the atomic bomb was invented, there was the Clock Symphony.
That's correct.
Let's listen.
And so Haydn would perhaps start off with just a little simple clock motive that you can hear underneath, and then suddenly there would be this dramatic outburst. And that's like Shakespeare. It's the secret of all great drama. You have contrasts, and the secret of great music is
Sure, because he lured me in with that and then he goes kaboom.
Yeah, and it's the seduction motif, but then perhaps not quite so seductive when,
Yes.
when the boom happens.
I wonder if Haydn was seductive in his other life, the salacious part of his life. Do you know?
Oh, you know, this is a family show, and I wouldn't like to comment on
Okay,
that.
but
We
so
know that Mahler was, for instance.
apparently,
Yes,
Mahler
very
had a
so.
tiny. Mahler's wife,
Alma Mahler.
Alma, had an affair.
She had an affair.
Didn't she with the
an architect called Walter Gropius.
Yes,
Sadly.
yes. So should we go back for a moment to Haydn, Joseph Haydn? So you're doing this because you're illustrating what at the actual performance?
Well, normally at a symphony concert we have a concerto soloist, a great pianist or a violinist who performs with us. But in this particular concert, the orchestra are the stars, as they usually are once a year in a program like this. They're the stars every week. But on this particular occasion, these are virtuoso pieces. The Haydn is a very difficult and wonderful 18th century symphony, and the Mahler Adagio from the 10th Symphony is an extraordinary piece.
So will you
expressive.
play all the movements of Haydn?
We'll play all the movements of the Haydn, the only movement that Mahler finished of the 10th Symphony.
Okay, so you start with Adagio. Do you back to Haydn?
Going back to Haydn, we start with our first movement. It begins with an Adagio, and it's a very...
Which means Maestro.
Which means very slow.
Okay.
And really the great thing about this particular movement is that it starts off tragically, but then becomes one of the funniest movements of music, I think, that there is, just full of little silences. He was the master of silence, so he knew when to suddenly stop and then how to make you smile. And that's actually the mastery of Joseph Haydn.
Really?
And that's evident a lot in the Clock Symphony.
So the pause. And is the clock
pause.
ticking all the way along? Do you hear
Oh,
under
no,
it
no,
always
no, no.
tick-tock,
We only
tick-tock?
we only hear the clock in the second movement.
Okay.
And actually that's what gave the symphony its nickname. Haydn didn't call it the Clock Symphony. It's just
No.
been universally known as the Clock Symphony.
And does the second
ever since
movement
he
have
wrote
a
it.
name? I know I'm asking the dummy questions.
No, not at
but
all.
Is,
These
after you
are-
go from Adagio, you go to...
They all have titles, so I think the second movement is an andante, and but these are not titles per se that really affect the emotional content of the movement.
Okay.
They're just speed indications. So Adagio is the speed indication for the conductor. Very slow, very stately, and then it moves into an allegro, which is Italian for lively, and then it gets going. So
So you go to Allegretto, then you go to Vivace or something.
that's exactly
do?
right. You do, yes.
Well, I'm glad to know that.
It's going well.
It's going well. Now let's go to Mahler, Gustav Mahler, Austrian?
Austrian composer. Actually, he was born into a Jewish family. He was an extraordinarily creative artist. He was a great conductor, one of the greatest conductors of his day. Unfortunately, he died just before recordings came in, so we don't have any orchestral performances. We do have one or two piano rolls that he recorded, but basically a huge influence as a conductor and a composer, particularly in the first 10 years of the 20th century when he was director of the Vienna Opera.
So he was, what, 1900, 1910?
Yeah, he was born in, I think,
somewhere in
1856. He
there.
died in 1911.
Okay. So, Adagio from Symphony Number 10. He died before the symphony was complete. Is that
That's
true?
correct. So he wrote this movement at the very end of his life when his relationship with his much younger wife, Alma, was under threat because of her affair with Gropius. And the great thing about this music is that it's impassioned, it's yearning, and it's extraordinary music.
So he was in pain.
He was in
Or
pain
was he
emotionally.
aware?
He was dying of a streptococcal infection,
Oh,
which
dear.
was afflicting him for at least 18 months. Nowadays, he would have been cured by penicillin, but of course, in those days,
Not
it
then.
didn't exist.
So let's take a listen
Absolutely.
to Mahler. And this is first movement,
This is the only movement.
the only movement. One movement.
Yes.
Must be the affair, is it?
This would be his wife, Alma, and he was very fond of walking in the Austrian Alps. Walking was his passion, and as you can see, a very beautiful woman. That photograph, I think, comes from a little later in her life. She died as recently as 1961, but this music is extraordinary. It's impassioned, and Mahler, although he looks very tall there, was actually a very short man, and was a firebrand, terrorizer of musicians, and very blunt, spoke his mind in a very abrasive way, but was forgiven by all and sundry because of his genius.
Of course, as often composers are.
They are, yes. I'm afraid they're a sinful lot
As
on
you
the whole.
know.
Not all composers, present company not.
Well, when you think music theory is dull,
Oh, I think it's the most fascinating thing
I
in the
know,
world.
but some people think, oh, music theory, I don't think. But then when you read about the lives of the Haydns and the Mahlers, and perhaps John Adams, when we come back, we'll hear a little bit from Dr. Atomic, the Dr. Atomic Symphony. I'll let you set it up, and we'll talk about the man who invented the bomb.